This is All India Radio. In the weekly program Current Affairs, we now bring you a discussion on conclusion of 27th session of Conference of Parties of the UNFCCC, takeaways and way forward. The participants are Chandra, Bhushan, founder CEO of International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology, iFOREST, and Ashish Chaturvedi, Head of the Environment, Energy and Resilience at UNDP India. Moderator is Sonu, Sood, AIR Correspondent.
The 27th session of Conference of Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is going on in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. 2 weeks of hectic parleys and negotiations between representatives from countries across the world have taken place on how best to tackle crises and threats arising due to climate change and how to mitigate risks and adapt with the changing times. To discuss the key outcomes of COP27, Mr. Chandra Bhushan and Mr. Ashish Chaturvedi, warm welcome to you from All India Radio.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you.
Mr. Chandra Bhushan, you are there where the action is taking place. What, according to you, are the key takeaways so far from COP27? Our Environment Minister, Shri Bhupendra Yadav, had said COP27 will be a COP of implementation. How far have those expectations been met?
Well, so far, this COP, like previous COP, is mired between, difference of opinion between developing countries. There are a number of unresolved issues that needs to be completed today, but most probably it will not. The COP is likely to be extended for a day or two. But my hope is that some of the critical issues like loss and damage, a separate fund for loss and damage that is being demanded by developing countries will be agreed at the COP. If not, then this COP will be considered a big failure. Similarly, the issue of phasing down of all fossil fuels, which India is proposing, should be there in the final text because so far the focus has been on phasing down of coal, which is a major source of energy for countries like India. But many countries who are dependent on oil and gas are reluctant to discuss the reduction and ultimately phasing down of oil and gas consumption as well. But we all know that we cannot solve the climate crisis without phasing down all fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas. So that's the second issue. If the world does not agree on phasing down all fossil fuels, then you can understand that the fundamental premise of climate change is to reduce emission from fossil fuels. If you cannot agree on that, then again, that would be a big letdown from COP27. So while there is a lot of expectation from COP27, so far the progress has been quite slow, and let's hope for the best for the next 24, 36 hours and hope for a good outcome.
So looking at the fact that the historical emissions by the developed countries have contributed greatly to the overall carbon footprint that we see today, what is the argument against contributing to loss and damage by the developed countries?
Well, the fact is this, that developed countries have always avoided a separate funding mechanism for loss and damage because loss and damage is intrinsically linked with liability and compensation, which essentially means that the losses that are happening in the developing countries because of extreme weather events has to be compensated for. So it's a very legal term that if someone has polluted the climate, then they should pay for it. So there is a liability component. And developed countries are very worried about the liability aspect because the liability aspect can become a legal international dispute. It can go for decades. So they have been quite reluctant to discuss loss and damage because it could make them liable for decades to come. Now, developing countries are saying that, are offering a fig leaf by saying that we can discuss the legal aspect once you agree to a separate fund. So there is certain give and take that is likely to happen. But the other point to understand is that China is now also a major historical polluter. It's obviously is the largest current polluter. 25% of the global emissions are coming from China currently. But China, which was not a major historical polluter 20 years back, like India, is now a major historical polluter. So there's also a demand that China, which is spending billions and trillions of dollars on Belt and Road initiatives in hard infrastructure and giving money to other developing countries, will also contribute to loss and damage. So that discussion has also come in. In fact, a president from a Caribbean country actually said that India and China should pay for loss and damage. So this entire loss and damage debate has got mired into who should pay, from where the money should come. So my sense is that you are not going to see a clear-cut decision at Sharm el-Sheikh on loss and damage. At most, you will get a decision to continue discussing this for another 1 or 2 years.
Ashish ji, talking of the cost element, what will be the cost element of India's transition to low carbon development? And apart from mobilization of domestic finance, how much support, both in finance and technology, will be needed from international sources, from developed countries?
So this is where the strategy doesn't give you exact numbers in terms of the costing, but it gives you ballpark figures. So it cites a few studies, and the range is in tens of trillions of dollars. So it's not an insignificant amount, right? When you actually look at the commitment, the global commitment to a quantified goal for climate finance, it was $100 billion globally, right? So of course, the needs of a country like India would be way, way, way higher than what the quantified goal for all climate finance is concerned. But of course, that climate finance that we are talking about is supposed to be catalytic. It can actually leverage and mobilize many amounts, many multiples as compared to what is provided by developed countries. So coming back to the second part of your question about the amount of finance which is going to be made available, I think for a country like India, it's always going to be a minuscule proportion of its needs. The new quantified goal has to be negotiated. The developed countries have not been able to meet the goal of $100 billion yet. We need to agree on a much more ambitious goal going forward. But given the complexity of the global economy right now and the sort of crises that all the countries are facing, it's going to be a fraught battle. And I don't think the ambition of raising the quantified goal would be that easy. I think we'll really be having a challenge going forward.
So if we talk broadly and the current situation, what is the situation of climate finance from developed countries to developing countries for adaptation and loss and damage?
The loss and damage debate has been very contentious over the last 10, 12 years. So it's great that it's on the agenda. And of course, there has been lots of negotiation back and forth. And we'll see that during the course of this week in Sharm el-Sheikh, more intense negotiations would happen. But of course, the here and now, the climate is changing. Communities are suffering. Vulnerable communities are already suffering huge losses and damages. And some countries have come forward, right? So Denmark's made some commitment. Scotland's made some commitment. But these are token gestures. So these are in the range of $3 to $5 to $10 million. What we need is massive amounts of money to come to adaptation as well as loss and damage. So we have to wait till the negotiations come to an end during the course of this week. It's not going to be easy. I think we're already seeing a lot of resistance from developed countries. But I think one needs to find somehow a much more transformative way of thinking about negotiating as far as loss and damage is concerned. We have to take a much more humanitarian angle to this as well, because people all over the world will suffer. But some countries, because of the developmental deficits, will suffer a lot more.
When looking at top emitters, can you tell us about the rationale behind developing countries' demand that historical emissions also be taken into account and responsibility fixed in a fair and equitable manner?
If you look at the science behind climate change, it clearly says that what matters for the changing climate and greenhouse gas emission and global warming is the concentration of carbon dioxide equivalent in the environment and in the atmosphere. Now, that happens historically, right? So countries which have emitted more in the past should actually take a much more sort of larger burden of climate action. This is the rationale why developed countries which have grown on the basis of fossil fuels would need to contribute a lot more. And this is where the common but differentiated responsibility agenda and sort of the foundational principle of the UNFCCC is the common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. There has been, of course, some dilution of that principle, but I think the differentiation amongst developed and developing countries remains. And that's why I think the developing countries are well-nigh sort of in the right spot to argue that there has to be some historical responsibility. And therefore, if you have historical responsibility, then you should actually be financing the low-carbon transition in developing countries now as well. And this is the reason why we've seen a lot of these negotiations over the last few years talking about finance and access to technology.
Mr. Chandra Bhushan, so this is the first time that loss and damage has actually been included on the agenda. If we talk of adaptation and mitigation, In this direction, what is the stance of the developed countries? We keep talking about this concept of just transition so that the developing countries get a fair chance at growth and development, which in fact the developed countries, when they were going through that stage, they did not have any such considerations hindering them. So what is their stance regarding this?
I think there has been very positive progress on just transition because there is a clear understanding that without having a fair and just transition, developing countries will not be able to reduce their fossil fuel dependence. So before COP, as you know, the G7 countries signed two agreements with Indonesia and South Africa. They are giving financial support in tune of $20 billion to Indonesia for just energy transition partnership. They have given about $8.5 billion in JETP partnership to South Africa. But right now, the details are not there. But my sense is that developing countries will require far more resources than what is being offered to them on just transition. The good news is that at COP, there is a decision to develop a 2-year work plan on just transition at UNFCCC. That more or less has been agreed. It means that just transition is now part of a formal negotiating process at UNFCCC.
Environment Minister Bhupinder Yadav launched India's long-term low-emission development strategy, LT-LEDS, becoming one of only 57 countries to do so. Ashish ji, how do you see this determined and proactive approach of India to fight climate change despite being a developing country? And what are the key highlights of India's long-term low-emission development strategy?
I think it's indeed a great moment that a developing country like India, has submitted its long-term emission development strategy. Before I start answering your question about the key highlights, I'd like to give you a little bit of a background and the Prashtbhumi, as they call it, of the low emission development strategy. So if you look at the first sort of document, there are 4 broad highlights which the government of India has talked about, which kind of articulate the need for the low emission development strategy. The first one being that India has contributed very little to global warming. And this is in fact brought out by the best available science that from 1850 till 2019, India has contributed only, well, in fact, all of South Asia has contributed only 4% of global emissions. So India is a relatively small player as far as contribution to global warming. India, of course, is a developing country, so it still has significant energy needs for its development, and this is also very clearly articulated in this strategy. And India is committed to pursuing low-carbon strategies for development, and it's actively pursuing them. So in fact, the Prime Minister in the COP26 in Glasgow announced the Panchamrit, which was lauded world over, and India has expanded its renewable energy capacity dramatically over the last decade or so. And finally, so since climate is already happening and we've already seen the impacts in our own country, as well as in other parts of the world, India also needs to build climate resilience. So if you have these 4 sort of background elements, then as a result of that, India has articulated 7 broad areas of transition as a part of this low emission development strategy. The first one is basically about low carbon development of electricity. The second one is related to low carbon transport system. The third one being sort of adaptation in urban design and in fact in urban areas because India is going to sort of rapidly urbanize. Then the fourth one is about the industrial sector, how to decouple the growth of the industrial sector from emissions. The fifth one is about carbon capture and storage, basically sucking out the carbon from the environment and then trying to utilize it for productive purposes. The sixth one is on enhancing forest and vegetation cover. And the final one is about the economic and financial aspects of low carbon development. So it's a fairly comprehensive package, and I think we are on our way. We are on a good way.
Mr. Bhushan, India has followed up its bold move last year at COP26 of pledging to a carbon emission reduction calendar by releasing this year at COP27 its long-term low-emission development strategy, thereby committing to a pragmatic and practical roadmap of how to achieve its carbon mitigation targets. Laudable and inspiring move from a developing country like India?
No, absolutely. In fact, I would say that considering some of the controversies that happened at Glasgow last year, India has been very proactive. In fact, it has batted from the front foot. It released its long-term plan, which is quite comprehensive. It's being appreciated at many quarters. Similarly, India's call to phase down all fossil fuel has received wide support. India has been an active voice for setting up of loss and damage fund. So overall, India has ticked all the right boxes at Sharm el-Sheikh, quite a significant improvement from how we were at the back foot at Glasgow.
And what is the situation regarding the other countries, other developing countries and the developed countries as regards giving such, concrete commitments?
You have, frankly, it moves very slowly. And therefore, with the kind of announcements that were done at Glasgow, we should not be expecting similar sort of big commitments at Sharm el-Sheikh. My sense is that if we get 2 or 3 things at Sharm el-Sheikh, it will keep the COP process alive and ambitious. One, that we should agree that we need a loss and damage fund. And if that agreement is there, then we can thrash out the details in next 1 or 2 years. The second is we should keep 1.5 degree target at site, which means that developed countries will have to do rapid decarbonization than what they have promised so far. Developing countries will also have to reduce emissions because for 1.5 degrees Celsius, none of us have enough carbon space to emit. That's the second point, keep 1.5C alive. And third, that we should start spending more resources and money on just transition so that there are enough momentum in developing countries to start moving towards renewable energy, green manufacturing, electric vehicles, as well as to start developing new economic diversification, jobs, and other opportunities in fossil fuel areas. So if we can get these 3 or 4 things, we should be happy with Sharm el-Sheikh.
Moving on, Mr. Chaturvedi. So in this context, how do you see India's progress on renewable energy, greater use of nuclear energy, as also enhancing R&D into future technologies such as green hydrogen, fuel cells and biofuels?
So on renewables, especially solar and wind, I think India has had remarkable success. So in terms of installed capacity, we are 4th in the world. And of course, transition has been remarkable. Of course, now we are trying to sort of start thinking about how to make the solar panels and the windmills inside India. The National Hydrogen Mission, of course, was launched a couple of years ago. It aims to make India a hub for green hydrogen. And the strategy also talks about tripling nuclear power capacity by 2032. So we're really talking about a fairly diversified energy mix in the next few years. And of course, reliance on fossil fuels will be continuing for the next foreseeable future as well, because India needs to provide, energy security to its 1.4 billion people. But at the same time, the kind of costs which are incurred for the renewable energy transition, you need some kind of reliance on fossil fuels to stabilize the grid. And I think this is going to be the benchmark for big energy transition that we're talking about.
Environment Minister Bhupendra Yadav, representing India at COP27, pointed out that rich nations had not met their commitments for the 2020 deadline and called upon rich countries to intensify their carbon mitigation efforts and share their plans as to how they will reach net zero emissions, which he said developed countries should reach even before 2030. How do you see this leadership stand taken by India on behalf of developing countries?
The stand is mostly justified. The fact that developed countries should take a much stronger responsibility towards climate action as far as financing and access to technology is concerned. Now, reality of the global economy, I don't think it's going to be easy to start sort of the developed countries trying to take more responsibility before 2030. The push for collective action is important, but we need realistic timelines and realistic commitments. And for that, you will need to really negotiate. But I think it has to be also about how do we set up cooperative mechanisms so that we can globally achieve these targets.
What is the significance of global carbon budget, and how crucial is equitable and fair consumption of carbon budget by various countries? In this context, India's Environment Minister Bhupendra Yadav has raised the issue of many developed countries turning back to increased fossil fuels consumption in recent times, which you also referred to just now. Can you tell us a little more about how this issue can be resolved?
The target of achieving 1.5 degrees or 2 degree warming to contain the global sort of warming to less than 2 degrees would imply that there is a carbon budget which is available for the entire, the global economy, the global society, the entire mankind. So that global budget needs to be appropriated and sort of allocated equitably in a just manner amongst developed and developing countries. The argument about what the minister said was that, developed countries have actually exhausted or overdrawn their share of the global carbon budget. and they should leave adequate space for developing countries because they still need to develop to give a good quality of life to their own citizens. Now that's the concept and that's the struggle. That's basically the crux of the negotiations. Now, how do we allocate allocate the carbon budget amongst developed and developing countries is where you need rules, you need some kind of an agreement. And of course, that agreement is not going to be reached in one COP after another COP. I think it's an evolutionary process and there is negotiation on commas and full stops. So I don't think we'll come to an agreement on what is the actual share of carbon for each of these countries. But I think the minister was well within his rights to actually articulate this position. And India will fight for the fair share of our carbon budget. And if we get it, well, it should ideally be allocated that space, or we should be allowed to grow by taking some part of the budget as part of our growing plan. And I think this is well justified as a negotiating tactic.
Mr. Chandra, the global carbon budget is adhered to very strictly and the allocations are made.
Well, carbon budget debate is a theoretical debate. I don't think countries are ever going to agree to proportioning the carbon budget within themselves. That's not going to happen. I think we have to be practical about it. There isn't much carbon budget left for 1.5 degrees Celsius. I think it's only about 10 years of emissions. So our carbon budget is going to run out by 2030, 2035. And the history of UN Convention on Climate Change is that formulas never work. So I am not sure that countries are going to agree to divide the carbon budget. That's not going to happen. And therefore, we have to be pragmatic in terms of looking at how do we go beyond carbon budget and make sure that, emissions everywhere is minimized. That should be the approach.
So this idea which you are saying that emissions from every source, they have to be controlled, that should be the approach. It's it's a global crisis. This is not one country's crisis. So you feel the concepts like lifestyle for environment, they will have a great resonance across the world.
No, absolutely. I think the initiative that Government of India has taken in terms of lifestyle for environment is a great initiative. It's a unique initiative. No country has done that. I think this is a great idea, putting responsibility at individual level to reduce our carbon footprint, our ecological footprint. And I think this is a great idea that India should push. It will make a difference. But in big picture, we will also have to be aggressive about decarbonizing the economy as a whole. We are right now doing very well on renewable energy. I think we will have to move towards making sure that we produce our industrial goods also without emitting carbon dioxide. India is already very ambitious on electric vehicles. So all in all, with economic scale transition along with individual responsibility, there is a chance that we will be able to restrict the damage that climate change may cause. So I'm very appreciative of the LIFE initiative.
Ashish ji, what do you feel energy efficiency and life, the lifestyle for environment, you feel these are important initiatives which need to be followed the world over?
Well, LIFE is, of course, a global mission which the Prime Minister launched. And UN agencies, we are supporting very strongly, as UNDP, we are supporting very strongly the Lifestyle for Environment mission because data suggests that almost 1/4, anywhere between 1/3 to 2/3 of global emissions can actually be sort of influenced by individual choices on what we eat, how we dress, how we what kind of transportation choices we make, what kind of holidays we take. So I think these are all choices which influence our material and carbon footprint. And therefore, I think Lifestyles for Environment is a very strong message. And I think India has a very strong role as a global leader in bringing this message to the rest of the world. And this priority is also articulated very strongly in upcoming presidency of India for the G20. Energy efficiency is a no-brainer. The best energy saved is the one that you don't use. So if you can actually have energy efficient appliances which reduce the energy consumed per unit of use of those products, I think energy efficiency, and India has done brilliantly well with the Energy Star labeling initiated by the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, which still continues. And more appliances, I would say all appliances which use electricity should actually be brought under that ambit, especially appliances which use a lot of electricity like air conditioners and refrigerators and other kinds of equipment.
Mr. Chandra, could you say the common but differentiated responsibility is CDR and according to the respective national circumstances, this basic guiding principle of United Nations for climate change, how do you see this playing out? Again, it is you can say it has to be executed voluntarily?
Well, in 2015, in Paris Agreement, common but differentiated responsibility was diluted significantly. And that dilution has continued. Even today, I think yesterday at Sharm el-Sheikh, US was not keen to actually write common but differentiated responsibility in the text. And there was huge opposition from developing countries on that matter. But overall, as I see it, that over a period of time, common but differentiated responsibility has become more about national circumstances. Because, some of the developing countries which were developing in 1992 when the convention was signed are now not developing countries. To say that China is a developing country would be a gross, misrepresentation of what developing countries mean, or for that matter, Saudi Arabia. So I am in favor of having a much more nuanced view of what a common but differentiated responsibility is. I do not like India and China to be clubbed together, which has happened and continues to happen. China is a very different country than India. Its emissions are, 5 times more than India. So there is no way that we should be, clubbed together. Similarly, Saudi Arabia is a very rich country. All the Gulf countries, and calling Gulf countries as developing countries and as recipient of funds would be a gross injustice to least developing countries. So I think we need to have a nuanced view, and I have been speaking about it.
Overarching issue of climate finance. What is the progress on that? Climate finance, of course, we have touched upon it right in the beginning of the discussion, but there were certain targets which were set. Now, how far have they been met, and what do you feel, what is the future? How will this, if the developed countries don't pay, first of all, what is the possibility of their contribution increasing? And if that doesn't come forth, how do you see the developing countries and the poor countries financing these adaptation, mitigation measures and also tackling loss and damage?
Well, for the past 7 years, they have not met their $100 billion commitment. This year also, they have not met. They are talking about Ukraine and Russia conflict as the reason why they are not meeting their commitment. But the fact is they have not met their commitment. Most of the money they have given has been in the form of loan and investments. The grant component has not been very high out of $100 billion. So therefore, this $100 billion, if they have so much difficulty in meeting $100 billion, and every estimation shows that for adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage, the requirement is actually in trillions of dollars. So if developed countries have problem providing $100 billion, you can understand where they will be when the discussion is on trillions of dollars. So I'm not very optimistic about them fulfilling their commitment. I think we have to be a little more smarter now. Every time they come and put out this number saying that they will give us money and they end up not giving us that kind of resources. So we should now start talking about a major reform in global financial system, which is favorable to us. Right now, the cost of capital in countries like India is very high, whereas in the US and Europe, you can get capital at interest rate of 3 to 5%. In India, the minimum interest rate is 12%, which in many ways puts us on the back foot as far as investment in green economy is concerned. So I think instead of asking them to give us a small amount of money, which in any case they are not giving us, we should be demanding now a major reform in global financial system, which is favorable to us. India is even better right now. If you look at the interest rate in Africa, it could be 15 to 20%. It is almost impossible for African countries to actually invest in renewable energy. So India, in my view, and there is a wide recognition of this issue that we should start talking about global financial system reform. G20 is with us this year. We are the head of G20, and this should be one of the big agenda for G20, which can then percolate to next year COP and other climate negotiations.
Thank you so much for these detailed discussion and analysis, Mr. Chandra Bhushan and Mr. Ashish Chaturvedi. Thank you so much.
You were listening to a discussion on conclusion of the 27th session of Conference of Parties on the UNFCCC, takeaways and way forward. The participants were Chandra, founder CEO of International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology iFOREST, and Ashish Chaturvedi, Head of the Environment, Energy and Resilience at UNDP India. Moderator was Sonu, Sood, AIR Correspondent. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio.